Little girl burst into courtroom and says 3 words. FBI arrests judge immediately. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that makes the air feel heavy. Like a storm is about to break, lawyers sat stiffly at their tables, their faces unreadable. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes and a stern face, tapped his gavel lightly against the wood, signaling the room to settle. The case being discussed wasn't just any case. It was one that had drawn attention from all over. Whispers had spread through the hallways before the trial even began. Something about corruption, something about power being abused. But no one expected what was about to happen next. Then, just as the proceedings were getting underway, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly swung open with a loud creak. Heads turned. The bailiff stepped forward, prepared to send out whoever had just disrupted the trial. But then they saw her, a little girl, no older than 9, standing there with wide eyes and shaking hands. Her hair was messy, her clothes slightly wrinkled, as if she had run straight here without stopping. Her chest rose and fell as she struggled to catch her breath. The entire room seemed frozen in time. No one knew what to say, what to do. A child, out of nowhere, in the middle of an important legal proceeding? It didn't make sense. The judge's eyebrows furrowed, his mouth twisting into something close to annoyance. "Young lady, you cannot be in here," he said firmly, his voice echoing through the high ceilings. "This is a court of law. Where are your parents?" But the girl didn't move. Her tiny hands balled into fists, her knuckles white. Tears welled in her eyes, but she swallowed them back. She wasn't here to cry. She was here for something bigger, for something that had taken every ounce of courage she had left. Then, just when the tension became unbearable, she spoke. 3 words. That was all. 3 small, simple words that shouldn't have meant much. But the moment they left her lips, the entire courtroom changed. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The lead prosecutor's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the desk. A woman sitting in the back covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Even the bailiff, a man who had seen just about everything, looked frozen in place. But the judge, his reaction was the most telling of all. His face drained of color, the authority he carried just moments ago disappearing in an instant. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. His hands, which had always been steady and controlled, trembled as they gripped the edge of his bench. For a second, there was complete silence. Then came the sound of movement. Several people in dark suits, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, suddenly stood up. Their presence had been unnoticed before, blending into the sea of legal professionals and reporters. But now they moved with purpose, their expressions unreadable. FBI agents. The moment the realization set in, chaos erupted. The agents pushed past the wooden benches, moving swiftly toward the front of the courtroom. The judge, now visibly shaken, shot up from his seat, knocking over a glass of water in the process. His voice, usually firm and commanding, was filled with panic as he stammered, "Now wait just a moment." But it was too late. "Judge Malcolm Carter," one of the agents said, his voice steady, professional. "You are under arrest." A collective gasp echoed through the room, followed by an eerie hush. No one could believe what they were seeing. Judges were supposed to be the ones upholding the law, not breaking it. The very idea of a man like him being led away in handcuffs felt almost impossible. The judge shook his head rapidly, his breath coming in sharp bursts. This is a mistake," he said, his voice hoarse. "I have done nothing wrong." But his eyes darted toward the little girl, the fear in them unmistakable. The lead FBI agent didn't respond. He simply motioned for his team, and within seconds, they had the judge's hands pulled behind his back, metal cuffs clicking into place. The once powerful man, who had ruled over countless cases, was now the one being taken away. But the question remained, what had just happened? Who was this little girl? And what had she said that changed everything? The crowd murmured, trying to piece together the shocking turn of events. Reporters fumbled for their notepads, their pens racing across pages, already preparing to break the biggest story of the year. But no one had answers, only questions. The girl, still standing in the doorway, finally let out a slow, shaky breath. She looked small, fragile even, but there was something in her eyes, something fierce, something that said she had seen too much for her age. As the FBI agents led the judge out of the courtroom, the whispers grew louder. The little girl had turned the entire justice system on its head with just 3 words. But what were they? The little girl stood frozen in the doorway, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the chaos erupting around her. People whispered in hurried voices, glancing between the judge being led away and the child who had changed everything with just 3 words. Some looked confused, others suspicious. The court clerk whispered something to the bailiff, who nodded before quickly stepping out, likely to make a call. The defense attorney sat motionless, staring at the judge as if trying to make sense of what just happened. But the girl wasn't paying attention to any of it. Her eyes were locked on one person, her mother, a woman sitting in the second row, pale and trembling, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden bench so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Tears welled up in the woman's eyes as she looked at her daughter, emotions flickering across her face. Fear, relief, disbelief. She had told her to stay home. She had begged her not to get involved. But now, there was no turning back. The lead FBI agent, a man in his early 40s, with sharp eyes and a hardened expression, crouched down in front of the girl, his voice calm but firm. "What's your name, sweetheart?" She hesitated, glancing at her mother before swallowing hard. "Sophie," she said in a small voice. The agent nodded. "Sophie, do you know what just happened here?" She did. She had known for a long time, but knowing and saying it out loud were 2 very different things. She looked down at her feet, her hands still shaking. He did something bad," she whispered. The agent exchanged a glance with one of his colleagues, who gave a subtle nod. The team had been investigating the judge for months, but they never had enough to act. Corruption at his level was buried deep, protected by layers of power and influence. They needed something undeniable, something no one could ignore, and now, in the most unexpected way, they had it. Sophie's mother finally found her voice. "Please," she said, her voice cracking as she rushed forward, placing herself between her daughter and the growing crowd. "She's just a child. She doesn't understand everything." But Sophie did understand. She had seen it with her own eyes. She had heard the whispers behind closed doors, had watched her mother cry herself to sleep more nights than she could count. She had lived in fear of this man, this powerful, untouchable man, who had made their lives a nightmare. The courtroom was still buzzing with confusion. Reporters scrambling to piece together what had just happened. Cameras flashed. Journalists whispered into their microphones, desperate to be the first to break the story. The judge, a man who had sent hundreds to prison, was now the one in handcuffs, his face pale, his expression unreadable. But the look in his eyes when he glanced at Sophie before being let out, it wasn't anger, it wasn't even shock. It was fear. The lead FBI agent turned to Sophie's mother. "Ma'am, I understand this is overwhelming, but we need to talk. Now." She hesitated, looking down at her daughter. "She's just a kid," she whispered again, as if saying it would somehow protect Sophie from what was coming next. The agent's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. And yet, she just changed everything. The room was closing in around them. Lawyers whispered among themselves. Court officials huddled together. And outside, the sound of sirens grew louder. The world was waking up to the scandal unfolding. Inside these walls, the agent gently placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder, lowering his voice. "Sophie, you need to tell us everything. How did you know? What did you see?" She bit her lip, her small fingers curling into fists. She had promised herself she wouldn't be afraid anymore. Not after everything he had done. Not after everything he had taken from them. She looked up, her eyes burning with determination. "It started with a letter," she said. Her mother's breath hitched, her face going even paler. The agent frowned. "A letter?" Sophie nodded. "Someone sent it to our house. I don't know who. But when I opened it, I saw everything. Papers, pictures, names, and—" Her voice wavered. "And proof." The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The agent's gaze sharpened. "Proof of what?" Sophie hesitated, her throat tight. She looked at her mother, searching her face for permission. Her mother closed her eyes for a moment, her body trembling. Then, with a slow, shaky breath, she gave a small nod. Sophie turned back to the agent. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but every word cut through the air like a blade. Proof that Judge Carter hurt people, that he lied, that he ruined lives. She swallowed hard, and that he was never supposed to be a judge at all. The agent's jaw tightened. His team had always suspected the judge was involved in something deeper than just corruption. But this was bigger than anything they had imagined. "Where is the letter now?" he asked carefully. Sophie hesitated again. Then she reached into the pocket of her jacket, her small fingers gripping something tightly. Slowly, she pulled it out, a folded, slightly crumpled envelope. The agent carefully took it from her, opening it with steady hands. His eyes scanned the papers inside, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he passed it to his colleague, who immediately pulled out a phone and made a call. Sophie's mother wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her close, her body still shaking. "What happens now?" she whispered. The agent exhaled, his expression grim. "Now, we take down everyone who helped him." The tension in the room reached a boiling point. Reporters tried to get closer, desperate for answers. Court officials exchanged nervous glances. Lawyers whispered urgently among themselves, some already making calls. And outside, just beyond the heavy courtroom doors, more FBI agents were arriving. The truth was finally coming to light, but what no one realized yet, what no one could have predicted, was that this was only the beginning, the weight of the moment. Pressed down on the courtroom like a storm ready to break, Sophie clung to her mother, watching as the FBI agent flipped through the letter's contents, his expression growing more serious with each passing second. The whispers in the room had turned into full-on murmurs. Reporters were on the edge of their seats, sensing that they were about to witness something far bigger than just the arrest of a judge. The lead agent looked up, his jaw tight. "We need to move, now." Before Sophie or her mother could process what that meant, the agents were already springing into action. Some rushed toward the back of the courtroom. Others spoke urgently into their radios. More agents poured into the building, their presence only confirming what everyone feared. This wasn't just about one corrupt judge. This was bigger, much bigger. Judge Carter, still in handcuffs, had been taken to the side of the room, but his eyes darted frantically as he listened to the commotion. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the one in control. "You don't understand," he hissed to the nearest agent. "You're making a mistake." The agent didn't respond. Instead, he spoke into his radio, his voice firm. "Secure every entrance. No one leaves this building until we know exactly who's involved." Sophie's mother held her daughter tighter, her breathing uneven. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The agent who had been speaking to Sophie shook his head. Not yet. Just then, a loud commotion erupted from the hallway outside. Raised voices, a crash, the unmistakable sound of running footsteps, and then silence. The agents tensed. The courtroom held its breath. Then, the door burst open. Another FBI agent hurried inside, his face tense. "We got him," he said. The lead agent nodded. "Good. Bring him in." A moment later, 2 more agents entered, gripping a man by the arms. He was older, with graying hair and a sharp, calculating face. Even in handcuffs, he carried himself like someone who thought he was still in charge. His tailored suit was slightly disheveled, as if he had been caught off guard. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A woman in the gallery clapped a hand over her mouth. The defense attorney, who had remained silent this entire time, finally spoke. No, that's not possible. But it was. Because the man they had just arrested wasn't just any lawyer, official, or businessman. He was the head of the state's Judicial Ethics Committee, the man in charge of keeping judges like Carter in line. And now it was clear. He had been protecting him all along. Judge Carter, seeing the older man now in handcuffs, paled. "You promised," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You said I'd be safe." The older man shot him a cold glare. "You got caught." The tension in the room was unbearable. The lead FBI agent turned back to Sophie, his eyes softer now, almost in awe. "You had no idea what you were stepping into today, did you?" Sophie shook her head slowly. "But you changed everything," he said. Her mother, still shaking, held onto her daughter like she was afraid to let go. "Is it really over?" This time, the agent nodded. "It's over." The realization settled in. The years of fear, of feeling powerless, of knowing the truth, but being too afraid to speak. It was all over. Sophie turned to her mother, her small fingers tightening around her hand. "We're safe now," she whispered. Her mother let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Tears slipped down her cheeks. But this time, they weren't tears of fear. They were something else. Something lighter. Something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Relief. Outside, news cameras flashed. Reporters scrambled to broadcast the shocking story, and the world began to learn the truth. The corruption that had been hidden for years was finally being torn apart, and it had all started with one little girl who refused to stay silent. As Sophie and her mother stepped out of the courtroom, the weight of what had just happened slowly sank in. People were whispering her name. Some even reached out, murmuring words of admiration. She didn't quite know what to do with it, but one thing was clear. She had done something that mattered. She had spoken up when no one else would. She had brought down a powerful man with just 3 words. And, for the first time in a long time, she finally felt free.